Hi, good afternoon. It's a hot, muggy Thursday afternoon here in Hualien, Taiwan. My recent reflections has been kind of looking back. My earliest memories is being in a crib, watching someone watch me. The witness, I've come to call that. Somewhere up in the corner, I can remember trying to verbalize to my mom, to ask her, does she really have the skill set? I'm not sure how much talking I was doing, but the sensation has lasted me through my life. I wasn't really sure when I first started getting inklings. Maybe it was then. Pardon me, I have to straighten my pictures, But maybe it was then the first glimpses I was getting of home. I knew home wasn't where I was, that home was somewhere else. And even as my sense of self was developing, I sensed somehow a deep falsity lying within. It was if we have to make up something to deal with the world that we find ourselves in, the world that surrounds us, that bombards us from all directions. So, probably more in self-defense than anything, I developed a persona, a personality. But within this personality, sensing always it really had no substance. Sensing the transcendental, labeling it home. In early years, start to explore avenues of returning to whence I came. And as I got older, as I left adolescence, toddler, elementary school, watching the growth of a false sense of self, my persona, I looked at it closely, mostly in amusement, in the sense that what appeared to my senses to be real was not the real at all. So, questions. It's the upwelling of questions. Who am I? Where am I? What am I? Why am I? What am I? Questions, questions, questions. And it led me to Zen. And I followed a quite rigorous Renzai Zen tradition, culminating with a couple of years in Japan in the temple. My only opportunity to cloister, to be amongst those of like mind, with similar searches. Well, I ended up leaving that, seeing myself somewhat as a failure, even though I had completed the first part of the training. I knew that this wasn't for me. Again, sense of failure. Just as failure that culminated in my awakening, my realization that I never was going to quiet my mind, master my mind, silence my mind. Even though the reward of clarity for having done so appealed to me so greatly. Having been a man who sees the grays in everything versus the world in white and black, I felt that somehow clarity was a missing element in my life, and I attributed it to my failure to silence the mind. And it wasn't until I began looking at my questions in 1997, when I came to Taiwan. I was a man of many questions. Why? Especially being introduced to a totally different culture and a new way to see things. With a deep understanding from the very beginning that although this culture seemed very foreign to me, chaotic, in fact, that underlying the chaos was a rhythm and a sense of how to live by people who had a tradition of thousands of years of civilization and dealing with the world as they found it. But still the questions persist until the first girlfriend with poor English skills, but she hit the nail on the head when she looked at me after a litany of questions. No, why? Okay. And interestingly enough, this was the beginning of the end, beginning of the ending of questions from me. Well, that took several more years to finally reach the point. In fact, 14 years. But the questioning had decreased, had toned down, and I wasn't really looking for anyone who might have a guess at best. But just prior to my permanent awakening, months, weeks, the questions stopped. I no longer had any questions. Even to the point when I finally was able to spend time with my teacher, and he'd ask me if I had any questions. And I never had a question for him because the need for questioning, or more importantly, the need for answers, the needs for anyone to supply me with any kind of answers, had disappeared. But what filled the void? Because it seems to be a law of the universe. If there's an empty space, fill it. And especially in this culture where I am now, it seems that they can't abide a sense, a space that's not occupied. They put it to some use immediately. A utilitarian society, after all. But space or emptiness seemed to be a threat. And it was a clue to me to look at this emptiness, because indeed this was part of my Zen training, was to empty, 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 empty. So emptiness was, instead of being feared, was revered. Revered? And something worth seeking for. But what is the source of people that we term spiritual seekers? What indeed sets them on this journey? For me, it was knowing from birth that everything that I was seeing wasn't real. That everything that I was becoming was not who I am. And I remember once someone asked me for a definition of my own brand of Zen that I'd been practicing once I let go of the rigorous discipline. After realizing that at best I could tame the mind and learn not to take it seriously, to look at it as a source of amusement and also as a tool on the path of jhana yoga, from thoughts to information to knowledge, culminating in wisdom. So after a life of feeling as the other, outside, the outsider, I turned that on its head and started looking for commonalities. And somewhere at this real fragile, the 6 months prior, several things occurred at once. It's letting go of questions, starting to look for similarities instead of celebrating differences, looking at what was divisive, coming to terms that silencing my mind, I don't want to say isn't going to happen, but best a work in progress. Wow, some doubt existed that is it even necessary? And I saw stillness representing clarity. So, along this process, I just surrendered my idea of quieting my mind and willingly sacrifice the clarity that was promised in this pursuit to quiet the mind. So, losing my questions, finding commonalities, embracing mankind, starting to learn about unconditional love, giving up on the rigors of my Zen practice and taking a more gentle path for myself. In all these things, there was one constant, and that was this tremendous drive to enlightenment, to becoming part of all that is. And it was in facing the enormity of this task and slowly dawning on me that it was not going to be attained by my efforts, rigorous efforts of 30 years of strict Zen tradition, to the point of surrendering to the possibility of silence in my mind, surrendering and in so doing, surrendering any hopes of stillness that promise clarity. So giving up what had always made me feel different, apart from. Instead, embracing unconditional love, recognizing that we are one and we are on this together. And I had read, of course, that Buddha wasn't enlightened till he gave up. And people seem to get stuck on, oh, I'll just give up. I give up. It's a kind of surrender. Yeah. But sometimes it's overlooked how rigorously he too pursued the path of discipline, the path of sacrifice, the path of denial. One mustn't forget Buddha's effort herein and deserve credit for the intensity. He got to the point where he was living on a couple of grains of rice a day. And I culminated in this really tumultuous 4 or 5 months, which now is kind of hazy and kind of blurred because it was happening on all fronts. It was basically not much less than a total transformation from where I had been. Everything that I held dear was up for examination. And somewhere in this intense self-scrutiny was combined with loosening of the precepts that I'd held so rigorously, accepting the shortcomings that I found. And I saw it as my failure because, as far as I knew at that time, other people had succeeded in this struggle to quiet the mind, really resided in the stillness. And were given the reward of clarity. But it was the acceptance of my own shortcomings. Wow, that's not working for me. I think I've tried hard enough for long enough. It was this another kind of surrendering, letting go of my conception of enlightenment, awakening, only reached through rigorous effort, through discipline, through adherence to strict structures. So this general loosening up, questions disappearing. The learning of compassion, of unconditional love, the observations that we all are one and the same. We're brothers and sisters. Sharing the common I want to say problem, but really is it a problem? Because a problem implies that it can be solved. How about condition? Sharing the common condition that we were not together, not experiencing us as we really were. And I don't really like the word giving up. I surrendered to my perceived failures. I learned to forgive myself, to love myself, to look on the world, to see myself in everything around me as ordinary. And to start understanding that ordinary borders on the extraordinary. Extraordinarily ordinary. So there no longer was something separating me from everyone else. And it's in this state that equanimity began to grow. And after all, equanimity was the promised reward of jhana yoga, my yoga of self-examination, of acquiring wisdom, equanimity. To be the same in the face of any conditions. And when I realized that I was in a state of equanimity, I thought that think, feel, experience. I experienced that I reached the pinnacle of the path of knowledge, the yogic path of knowledge, that I had learned to focus on. Got away from that Raja, the path of royalty, discipline, that promised, ultimately promised, clarity is the reward for reaching that pinnacle. So just as I wanted to talk about today, I named this All Rivers Flow to the Sea. And I thought, this flow to the sea, I meant the ocean, of course, but the poet in me reigns supreme. All rivers flow to the sea. Yeah. So I visioned what I had visioned earlier as paths up a mountain. And each of us ultimately will have our own path. And will be guided by from Christianity to Hinduism to Islam, whatever our avenue is, that we start at the base of the mountain. We learn to customize and accept that we're having our own path, and we reach the pinnacle, the top of the mountain. It's the same place that we could reach by the multitude of possible paths. And this has always stayed with me. This is the vision I had of us walking up a mountain, choosing our own path, step by step by step. But the newest analogy that just came to me was this: all rivers flow into the sea. And no matter the origin of the river and how far it has to travel, how windy it's travel, how dirty its waters get, they eventually reach the purity of the sea. Just as I had envisioned us reaching the pinnacle of the mountain. So indeed, I had a different understanding of Buddha and his giving up before he was enlightened under the Bodhi tree, before he sat in that extended meditation, extended period of meditation. Because I remember going through a phase quite clearly, okay, I give up, surrender, I give up. And waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for my reward to be permanent awakening, which, as I've alluded to before, is only permanent in the sense of our opportunity. It's the pinnacle of our success while in this body. But there's a lot more work, a lot more realms. It's a never-ending, open ending. But it was understanding that, like everything else in the spiritual path, this seems to be a unique and special opportunity for each and every one of us to come to an understanding, to start embracing the inevitable, actually. Even though before it happens we're not aware that it's going to happen sooner or later. We hear those words, but we don't really live them. So it was again a different understanding of what giving up meant, at least for me. There was nothing to give up. It was more about embracing what I was coming to see. Understanding that river that's flowing to the sea, that individual particle in that water that could represent each and every one of us. Together, every molecule is the same, just as all of us are the same. We're flowing down, and it can be from a trickle to a roaring river through narrow gorges. It's just a beautiful trick to celebrate. Understanding full well that we'll rest together in the calm embrace of the sea. So it was a deeper understanding of giving up. Actually, it turns out what I gave up is the remnants of a spiritual ego That is the biggest trap of jhana yoga, that you get so wrapped up into what you think you know, your accumulation of wisdom, your realization that it's possible to know everything that has been, will be, and is simultaneously. You develop this spiritual ego. And this is why all the pundits, all the teachers will say that jhana yoga is the most difficult. And it was this creation of a super ego, a spiritual ego, that was so insidious that it was hard to even recognize. So that's, to me, that's what giving up meant for me. I have no claim on what it meant for Buddha. Yeah. Any more than I would for any other one of us. Because we know that Buddha, what Buddha represented, is the link between all of us. So I wasn't even aware on a conscious level that I surrendered. I gave up my carefully crafted, longingly, painstakingly crafted, I might add, spiritual ego. My superego. I call it superego because it took a super effort to even see that it existed, to even be aware of its presence. But trust me, it took no superhuman, it took only human effort, which we all share, to give up this superego. Super effort to build, super simple, if you will, once you recognize this spiritual ego for the obstacle it truly is. So it's in the process of surrendering, of giving up this long-time companion that I found the peace, the equanimity to experience my permanent awakening.